I'm Sally O'Driscoll from Resisting Project 2025, and I'm talking today with J.W. Walker, who is the social media manager for Resisting Project 2025, but is also a seasoned activist. And we're going to be talking today about protests that are happening and hearing more about the No King's Day protests for Saturday, June 14th. So let me just introduce Jay. He's the social media manager for Resisting Project 2025, a queer Black leader and community organizer. He's a longtime New York City activist on LGBTQ+, HIV, and racial justice issues. He's a founding member of Rise and Resist, president of Gays Against Guns, and co-founder and lead organizer of NYC's Queer Liberation March. Jay's been active in the movement for Black Lives, anti-police brutality protests, and protests against LGBTQ+ violence. He's a staunch and outspoken ally of the trans community and organizes on issues related to the criminalization of LGBTQ+ people in Africa and the US, and on immigration and housing issues. He's worked with many African immigrant LGBTQ+ organizations. So Jay, before we get into what it's like to protest under Trump, could you tell us a little bit more background about what brought you to activism and what has sustained you through all of these years of progressive action?
Hi, Sally. Thank you. I grew up in a movement household. My mother had participated in the 1963 March on Washington, had been friends with Malcolm X when she lived in New York in the 1950s, and had actually even a few years before I was born run guns for the Black Panthers. And so I grew up with those stories as a child, and she was very uh, she found it very important to make sure that I understood the importance of standing up for human and civil rights. And so um, that mindset has always been a part of me. However, it really wasn't until I was in my early 30s that I actually did any street activism. That started around the murder of Matthew Shepard back in 1998. I helped form an organization called the October 19th Coalition, which formed after there was a very notorious incident where a group of mourning protesters, after Matthew Shepard had died, held a sort of political funeral in protest of his murder, and they were set upon by Rudy Giuliani's NYPD thugs on horseback, and people were trampled. It was a very, very horrible situation. And so there was a community meeting that I attended after that. And out of that, the October 19th Coalition was formed just to focus on hate crime murders against LGBTQ plus people, but also against Black people. Right around the same time as Matthew Shepard, a gentleman named James Byrd was murdered in Texas. He was tied to the back of a pickup truck and dragged through the streets. And so that was my entree into direct action activism. I also worked for Gay Men's Health Crisis for a while, and I did a lot of work, public work, and uh, with HIV and AIDS activism through JMHC. Um, and then I left it all behind when I left GMHC in about 2007, and just sort of had to get out of the sort of gay ink world. But it was in 2016 when the Pulse Massacre happened in Orlando, Florida, that I just felt that I had to take a stand. And so I attended a meeting at the LGBT Center again. And out of that, Gays Against Guns was formed. And then 6 months later, Donald Trump was elected, and then it all went off from there.
and has been going on since for you. So tell us a bit more about what are you doing with Resisting Project 2025 and with Rise and Resist particularly?
Well, with Resisting Project 2025, which also known as Stop the Coup 2025, we've been about educating people about the threat of Project 2025 for the last year and a half, a little bit more than a year and a half. And since Donald Trump took the Oval Office, I personally don't believe he was elected. Um, uh, we have been trying to show just how manifest Project 2025 is in every policy, in every executive order, everything that is coming out of this administration. What we're seeing is a sort of, to use a sports metaphor, which is kind of foreign to me, a flood the zone approach, where they are throwing so much of Project 2025 at the American people that it is dizzying, and it is hard for, I think, a lot of people to grasp because so much is happening all at once. And I think the wonderful work that you and AC Tedeschi are doing at Project 2025 at Resisting Project 2025 is sort of distilling that information to make it um, uh, attainable, graspable for the public, particularly with the Resisting Project 2025 Substack, that the work that you've been doing. With Rise and Resist, what Rise and Resist has been doing as a direct action activist group is choosing particular aspects of Trump policy to do direct action, to do organizing small actions, medium-sized actions, and large actions to call attention to just the totality, as much of it as we can, of the sort of un-American, unconstitutional actions that this administration is taking.
Right. As you say, it's as if there's a field of static and no one can see what's important, but that the work that you've been doing is pulling out pieces that people can actually understand, that you can make them visible, and that's a way in to resistance.
Exactly.
So we're going to come back to No King's Day at the end of our talk, but let's just very briefly set this up. Why is it called that? It's on Saturday, June 14th. Tell us a little bit about where this protest is coming from and what it's trying to achieve.
So the date that was chosen, June 14th, is because of the fact that Donald Trump is holding in honor of his own birthday uh, a military parade supposedly honoring the 250th anniversary of the American military. Um, in Washington, D.C., that the planning for it's costing tens and tens of millions of dollars and is taking a book straight out of totalitarian regimes like North Korea and Russia and China with these huge, coordinated, orchestrated military parades with tanks rolling in and just jingoistic rhetoric. That when it was announced, I think it was such a shock to the system of the American people that the organizers, the different groups that have been working on organizing actions since the inauguration on a national scale, including Hands Off, particularly, and Indivisible, and a few other organizations, are decided that rather than going to DC to counter protests, which would inevitably, most likely, result in violence from the Trumpists, uh, the much better move was to cancel that by having hundreds, if not thousands, of demonstrations all over the country, um, uh, to sort of just decry Donald Trump's sort of seizing of a uh, a dictatorial uh, uh, presentation of the American presidency. He's essentially declared himself to be a king. His followers are unironically treating him as such, and even saying as much. And it's very important that we note that for all its faults, for all its flaws, yeah, deeply embedded in the culture of this country is that we have a democracy, that we do not have a monarchy, that we do not have a dictatorship, that we elect our leaders, they have a set period of time to serve, and then we elect different leaders. And the fear is that so much of what Donald Trump is doing is to consolidate what so much that he is doing to consolidate power is perhaps to create a situation where he can cancel elections, either the midterm elections coming up in 2026 or even possibly the next presidential election in 2028.
Right. So what you're pointing out is a real ramping up of probably the first military parade of this type. As you say, harking not only to other autocratic regimes, but also backwards to the 1930s Germany and
Yes.
Hitlerian um, parades. Um, but so there's something very particular and new about what's happening, and that's going to be addressed on Saturday. So before we talk more about that, let's just go a little bit back into what's been going on recently, because No King's Day has been building on a series of protests over the last 4 months. And different issues have brought up different kinds of protests. So let's just talk about a few different issues and kinds of protests, and tell us a little bit more about what you think is working, how people are choosing the strategies, how the organizing is happening, just so we have a sense of background about this kind of rising movement of resistance that we're seeing here. So why don't we start with the Tesla protests, which spread like a wildfire?
Yes, the Tesla protests were actually begun. The very first one happened here in New York. The first two happened here in New York with just a few people from Rise and Resist. First, just I think two or three members of Rise and Resist went to the local Tesla here in New York City in the meatpacking district of the West Village, and stood outside with a few signs criticizing Elon Musk. Then the organization as a whole created its first larger protest that people really responded to, got a lot of media attention. And out of that, the Tesla takedown movement, which in the website, which were not started by Rise and Resist, they were just inspired by the work that Rise and Resist had done at those first two actions, really took off nationally. And the encouragement that people got from just the idea of being a part of a larger national movement really was our sort of attempt to flood the zone. Elon Musk was given just exorbitant powers through Doge, and Doge was, as we all know, a Project 2025 engendered attack on just the functionality of the American government. Uh, and I think that the thinking behind it was to damage Elon Musk's brand, his most profitable brand. And we did that very successfully to the end that he's essentially left his government work after a couple of months of these Tesla takedowns. However, it's also important to note that Doge is still there. And we cannot, on the one hand, we cannot let the Tesla takedowns stop because Elon Musk's influence, even though he and Donald Trump appear to be squabbling right now, is still there in the government. And the fact that he encouraged or fomented this desire among Donald Trump to bring in sort of the racist worst of the worst of South African uh, uh, people into this country under a ridiculous pretext that they were somehow undergoing a genocide. It speaks to the overwhelming white supremacy that we see spread throughout the Trump administration.
Right, but as you point out, Doge still has a lot of people working and burrowing deeper and deeper into all of the information that's available in federal websites, and that we have to keep our eye on that. But just to pay attention to the fact that the Tesla protests caught people's imagination in a way that, and went viral in a way that couldn't have been predicted and yet has been very powerful. Well, let's look at some other issues. Trans rights is tell us a little bit about any protesting and resistance that's going on there.
Yes, what's here in New York particularly, the movement for trans lives has really been sort of unrelenting because the attacks on trans people have been unrelenting in this country, much more so than during the first Trump administration. Really, the biggest sort of attack on trans people during the Trump administration was through the military, through the threat, the threat of removing trans members of the military from active duty. But but in the ensuing 8 years, there has been a concerted effort to demonize and otherize trans people by the far right. In the way that the far right has a long history of distracting by scapegoating one minority or another in order to deflect attention from the fact that it's the oligarchs and the billionaires that are actually having the most outsized and worst impact on the lives of most Americans, and instead for putting people's attention on people like trans people. The protests here in New York, particularly those that are focused on trans health care, have been particularly powerful. The access um, um, to trans supportive healthcare, particularly for youth, and the leadership that so many young trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people have demonstrated has been very, very powerful.
Yeah. Um, and as we saw on, we've been talking about Project 2025 and kind of reminding ourselves how closely Trump's policies hew to exactly what's said in that document. It's on the very first page. Toxic transgenderism is being predatory and ruining and indoctrinating our children. That is what that opening page or two of Project 2025 says. So we've seen that they kind of latched onto that very quickly as a wedge issue that they thought would demonize, as you say, a whole group of people and make Trump voters not trust another whole group of voters. So that's very important. And what about students? And, of course, last year, Palestinian protests about Gaza were on every college campus. That is not the case this year. But what else do you see going on?
Well, I think in particular, what we've seen is a sadly effective weaponization of the federal government's power against protests in support of the Palestinian people. The fact that very powerful and very well-moneyed organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, like AIPAC, have rather successfully colluded with the corporate media and the Trump administration to categorize any criticism of the genocide that is happening to the people in Gaza at the hands of the state of Israel, as being de facto anti-Semitic, completely ignoring the fact that so much of the leadership of the American resistance to Israel's policies has now, and for many, many years, long before October 7th, been led by Jewish-led organizations, by American Jewish-led organizations like Jewish Voices for Peace and Rabbis for Peace and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. These organizations have been at the vanguard of the movement for Palestinian lives for so long, for decades. And the fact that there has been this concerted effort to just ignore that reality, and that's been reflected throughout all of our mainstream news media, has been particularly disturbing.
And of course, when you add that to the all-out attack on universities as a whole that the Trump administration has been pursuing, the canceling of international students' visas, the pulling of funding, universities apparently feeling terrified that they will, be unable to continue. That has also put a damper on student protest.
Well,
Um,
yes, and well, and the thing is that it's sort of like it's a horrible thing to say, but everything that's happening in Gaza was almost a gift to the Trump administration because it gave them the pretext to attack higher education. And the attack on higher education, long before October 7th, was a central sort of tenet of Republican politics. They don't like they don't like university level education because university education, deals in fact and reality and an honest depiction of history. And all of that goes against the sort of fundamental um, uh, white supremacist, patriarchal motivating factors behind Republican politics.
right, and the universities are being portrayed as an out-of-touch elite that no longer knows what the American people want. That's the rhetoric that we're hearing.
By a bunch of people who graduated from elite universities.
Of course, of course. Now, let's just take a quick moment to think about USAID and funding foreign policy, and particularly PEPFAR, the extraordinarily successful kind of program that distributed drugs to treat HIV, and which has now been is being halted, even though it has been demonstrated to have saved way upwards of 20 million lives over the course of its program. What are we hearing in resistance to that?
What the sad reality of it is that Americans are very insular when it comes to our politics, generally speaking. The vast majority of Americans don't think about international issues when they are considering who to vote for. They are extraordinarily uneducated about things like international aid and PEPFAR. And so it has been a particularly daunting effort among healthcare activists and organizations like ACT UP, and Doctors Without Borders and others who do this work in the developing world, to highlight this issue in a way that Americans are able to respond to in real time. And so there's a lot more work that needs to be done to highlight these issues, to make people understand how important U.S. aid has been to um, encouraging democratic uh, democratic reforms in governments in the developing world, how much it is done to save lives, as you said, and the catastrophic effects that eliminating U.S. aid and eliminating PEPFAR are going to have across the world. I don't think that most Americans have even been able to wrap their minds around it.
Right. Well, looking at your backdrop, let's move for a second to the Say Their Names project, which is about CICAT, the prison in El Salvador, where many people have been deported by the Trump administration without any due process. And so Rise and Resist is behind, has started the Say Their Names protests. Tell us a little bit more about what's at stake there, why that's so important, and why making the individuals visible who have been deported is so important.
Yes. So Rise and Resist started this project in late April with a protest in front of the consulate and permanent mission to the UN of the country of El Salvador, which is in Midtown East, very close to Grand Central Station. And reading out the names, every name that we can get of about, I would say about 250 to 300 of the people who have been kidnapped and deported without due process to CICAT, to El Salvador, and imprisoned in CICAT. What we know is that for all of their claims about gang membership, for all of their claims about a lack of documentation, so many of these people are people who were not undocumented. There are people who were going through the asylum process for any number of reasons from countries that were not El Salvador, from countries like Venezuela and others. And they were simply, their personhood was ignored by the Trump administration. Their individuality was ignored by the Trump administration. It was a broad brush tarring of all immigrants from Black and Brown nations as being gang members, as being criminals, as being violent criminals and rapists and murderers, when the reality is that anyone who looks at the statistics knows that immigrants and undocumented immigrants, particularly actual undocumented immigrants, are far, far less likely to commit crimes in the United States than citizens are. The numbers are, there's a wide discrepancy in those numbers, and we know from wider than the CICAT detainments that that the people that the Trump administration is seeking out and trying to rip out of the country are so often small children and mothers and people who have lived here and worked here and paid taxes here for decades in some cases. People that are parts of the community, parts of deeply embedded parts of the communities that they live in. And now we're also seeing what's happening in LA, in Los Angeles, where Los Angeles is like the largest county in the country by population. Los Angeles City is the second largest city in the United States by population. And some estimates say that not just immigrants, but undocumented immigrants are up to 10% of the population of Los Angeles County. And all of them are under threat. And these are people who are so deeply embedded in the fabric of Los Angeles that the city, probably wouldn't be able to function. And the county probably wouldn't be able to function if they were all removed. And so we are seeing this huge pushback by Angelenos across the board. And that, for one, has been extraordinarily inspiring to me personally. And I think that work is going to continue in cities all over the country.
There has been a new development in the one of the most famous of the CICOT detainees, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was returned to the U.S. months in CICOT and then a different prison, even though the Trump administration admitted that he had been deported by an error. However, he was immediately indicted on his return to the U.S. and is now in a prison in Tennessee. Do you see any movement here? Do you see any effect? Do you see any change of the public attitude toward the deportations?
Um, uh, you know, I think that right in terms of the public attitude, I think that, again, it's that flood the zone sort of thing where people can't take in all the information that they need to in order to evaluate exactly what's happening. I think that the folks who like us who are paying attention uh, see these see these sudden charges for Kilmar as being very, very suspicious. That they are they all stem back from the people who were in his car when he was originally stopped, and then Pam Bondi, in her press conference, when she announced that he was being returned, started throwing out all of these allegations that had absolutely nothing to do with the charges that he was actually charged with, which leads me to believe that they don't actually have a lot of of evidence to support the actual charges, and they're trying to use the court of public opinion to sway people's opinions, to think that he is some sort of violent gang member and murderer and all these sorts of things that have absolutely nothing to do with the charges. So uh and the information on the actual charges that were filed um, really seem very sketchy and very incomplete. And so I think there's going to be a long period, or at least I don't know how quickly they're going to get this to trial. I think there's going to be a period at least of delving into the particulars of it. The fact that they didn't even notify his attorney that he was being returned to the United States, that his attorney found out about it from news reports, is another telling factor about just the lawlessness and the unwillingness to abide by any sort of constitutional norms of this
Right.
administration.
Because the important factor here is the right of all people, citizen or non-citizen, constitutionally guaranteed to have due process.
To do due process, and sending them all to CCOT in the first place was just an abominable, unconstitutional act.
Right. So let's
As
do
well, and I will say, as well as to Sudan and other locations around the world where they are also sending people.
yes, with very little known about them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's sum up for a second. We look at all these different kinds of protests, many different kinds, so an
Yeah.
array of different strategies. So if you were to sum up, how would you feel? Are the protests intensifying? What strategies should we be employing next? How are the protests going? What do you see here?
Um, what I will say is that I think the protests are very effective. They in comparison to 2017, they are much more widespread, um, getting much more attention. Um, and I think that is very positive. I think that the existence of the resistance from 2016 to 2020 made sort of laid a path for what's happening now and created the interconnections and the pathways of communication, both within local environments as well as nationally, so that the resistance to Trump 2.0 has been able to uh, achieve a sort of critical mass much more early than than elsewhere. I think in 2017, New York really kind of led the way because New Yorkers knew Donald Trump and knew him in a way that the rest of the country didn't. And so New York kind of led the way, but I think this time we saw a broad-based resistance immediately, and I think that was in large part due to all of the work of the resistance during the first administration. So I think that tactics are going to continue to evolve. They're going to have to be specific to what's happening in different localities, as well as what's happening broadly on a national scale, as well as the actions that Trump is taking. What he's doing right now in LA, for instance, with first the National Guard and now threatening to bring in the Marines, which is a frightening prospect of aiming the American military at the American civilian populace. And that that holds the possibility of an even greater constitutional crisis than what we've already seen. It's going to be very fluid. It's going to be very dynamic what the resistance is going to do. Um, but it is only going to grow because the outrages are only getting greater.
Right. I mean, in LA, we see Trump deliberately describing peaceful protests as a threat to the nation's security, and that is a very dangerous road to go down. And bringing in first National Guard against the wishes of the governor and the mayor of LA, and Marines now to quell peaceful protests. That is a new level of trying to chill free speech. So
Yeah,
yes, as you say, that is going to be we'll see how that evolves. Yeah.
yeah,
So I just want to point out that that is a crucial development, collaboration between national organizations and local, well kind of practiced
yeah,
community organizations. That's extraordinarily important for whatever's going to happen as we move down the road. And
absolutely.
and new. Also, I always feel symbolic to start protests and marches at the New York Public Library. Um, it's a significant bastion of free speech.
Yes.
And
Free speech and education and honesty and truth and history, all of it.
everything that we're fighting for, right?
Yeah,
So I always have a thrill to be standing between the lions at the steps of the New York Public Library, and I always think that that is a perfect place to start. I'm sure every other community has some place that means that to
that
them,
has that level of meaning. Yes.
wherever they are. Yeah. Okay, anything that just also want to underscore that No King's Day is going to be peaceful marches, that nobody is expecting or needing to do direct action, and that, as you say, people should feel safe to
Yeah.
come to those protests and express themselves. Anything else you want to say about that?
Just that, one of the greatest benefits of participating in protests like this is the sense of community that you can derive from participating, and the way that these protests enable people to connect with organizers and organizations that are doing this work and have been doing this work for ages and can really help people plug in to doing further resistance work. So it is going to be incumbent on all of us to do this work for as long as we need to do it. That it's important that people understand that the fact that Trump became ensconced in the White House for a second time is not shouldn't be taken as a they've won um, signal. I think it's more to the point that this can really be seen, this Project 2025, the second rise of Trump, everything that they're doing as being a last gasp, possibly, to the worst instincts of the American people over the years, that they're throwing everything um, at, at us in an effort to overcome what the true ideals of America are, regardless of how often America has failed to live up to those ideals. That those ideals are still instilled in us, and the way that we overcome them is together as an American people, with full understanding of what those ideals are, and that we can overcome this. And that's the most important part.
That is a very inspiring way to end our conversation, Jay. And I certainly hope that you are right, the last gasp. But, we're grateful to J.W. Walker, who's been giving us his perspective on current protests against the Trump administration. And especially, he's been giving us an intro to No King's Day, a day of protest that's coming up on Saturday, June 14th. So Jay, thank you very much for talking to us today and for your many years of dedicated activism. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sally.